Alrighty, g'day guys, welcome to a heuristic calling guide for Legion TD. So, I just want to say a couple of things very briefly to start with, and then we'll jump right into it. Firstly, have a look down in the description, right? At the top there'll be an Imgur link, and that'll have all the slides that I'm going to put here, or put on the screen here. That'll have all the slides on it, so you can screenshot those or just reference them more quickly if you want to. Doesn't stress me out. And also the video that'll come out alongside this, give that a watch because it will, it's an observation game, or I'm observing a game, and then I'm trying to talk about the calls in depth that are going on between both teams, what makes sense with what information. Right, so I definitely recommend giving that a watch if you're interested in not getting better at calling, even if you think I suck at calling, which I kind of do. At least getting an insight into what I'm sort of thinking, and you can take away any information you think is relevant and discard whatever you think is crap. Different people will get different benefits and different levels of benefit from it, and that's good. That's why discussion is always interesting. Anyway, the other thing, what is a heuristic? Heuristic is a rule of thumb, okay? I looked up that word because I figured it makes me sound smarter than saying a rule of thumb guide, and anything that makes me sound smarter, I'll take it because I haven't got a lot going on otherwise, right? So, for me calling, so now to actually get into the guide, for me calling in Legion TD, it's all about input and output, right? And your output is always the call or the decision, right? And in order to get to an optimal output, so an optimal call, you have your inputs. They are information and knowledge. These are two different things, right? Knowledge is your knowledge of the game, so which units are good on which waves, how your values look for any given wave, what your king spell does on any given wave, where you're strong, where they're weak, and all of that sort of stuff. So it's your understanding of the game, and everyone's understanding of the game is going to be a little different, but for the most part there'll be a lot of similarities and tie-betweens. And then you have your information, right? Your information is game specific. So for example, an information you might have on level 1 of a game is you have Elite Archer, your teammate has Aqua, another teammate has Ig, and the last teammate is playing, I don't know, Ghoul with Malformation, right? So you have the information of what your team has, and you'll have the information of your opponent's kill speed. What you can also think about is the information your opponent has. So they have the information of their rolls, you don't know what they are yet. They have the information of your kill speed, right? So that's something you can think about as well. So that is how I like to sort of consider calling or think about it, and I think it's, in my opinion, it's a good way to think about it. And it just simplifies actually breaking it into it, or breaking into it, especially if you're relatively new to calling or haven't really tried it before or anything like that. Alrighty, moving on. So we're just going to go through all the levels in the game, well, up to 21, because after that it just becomes a bit of a mess really. I'm just going to talk about some rules of thumb, and then some things you got to think about, things you might be looking for each of these levels, right? So level 1, you probably are going to want everyone on your team to be 2-0. If they're not 2-0, then your send is most likely just going to benefit the other team. You want to benefit from a slow game, okay? Because not only are you slowing the game down from early on, from level 1, there's also a higher than perhaps normal chance the other team sends 2, 3, 4, 5, right? Also 6 is an option, but yeah, that gets into scout territory, right? So 2, 3, 4, 5, and the game tends to get slower, right? Generally two things will happen. Either your opponents are happy with a slower game, and the game will slow down because they'll send back and forth, or your opponents will think, shit, we don't want a slow game, and they probably end up straight 7 or straight 10. Okay? In my opinion, Warriors has the highest chance of just backfiring, and why is that? You have the lowest amount of information. You don't know your opponent's kill speeds. You know nothing about your opponents, right? When you've decided to send Warriors, you know absolutely nothing. So you don't know kill speeds, you don't know any information, specific information in terms of units or anything like this, and there's a chance you just feed like a Lord Necro roll, and then your opponents play King 10, conservative King 10, they end up with 4 heals into a mid game and the game's been too fast for you to get the value to skip 15, and you end up playing a standard like King 15 game or whatever against a fed Lord Necro, and like there's just nothing you can do. So sometimes it will just be you send warriors, you feed the wrong lane, and there's nothing you can do. So that's why I personally don't like this call unless you have 3 or 4 roles that are actually going to have like a really hard time finding relevance in a standard game. That's my opinion. Different people think differently, but I don't like sending warriors very often at all. Okay, other calls you'll make on level 1 or before it starts. So you got regen 7 option. So generally you're thinking about regen 7 if you have bad early push, so your sends on 2 and 3 are pretty crap, and you don't benefit from like a slower game level 4. You also need to you kind of need to pray that you're playing those YOLO lanes and you actually take heals on 7, because if you regen 7 and the other team ends up being fucking fire overlords galore and you can't take heals on 7, well, it's pretty uncomfortable, right? Because that's the thing, this meta is an overbuild meta, right? And the more overbuildy the meta is, generally like the worse this regen 7 call gets, right? Successful. And I suppose in Lille, at least generally, most of the overbuilds will be relatively successful. If people are overbuilding for a certain level, they probably are doing it correctly, okay? So, you know, you're not going to see like 3-1 leaks to Ferb 3 Hermits. Oh, very rarely at least anyways. Anyway, what you're aiming for, or what you're probably looking at, is playing a low value game after level 10, because your overbuild units basically function a bit better in those environments, right? Rather than say Aqua, because Aqua will have like 700 value of Aqua, which you don't really want in the mid game. But I don't know, a Blaster lane, for example, maybe they have 1200 value of Blaster, but that's pretty okay to have in the mid game, right? So low value game generally is going to be what you're looking for with the sort of roles that are thinking about a regen 7. A lot of the time you're going to have to skip 10, because a lot of the time you're not calling regen 7 if you're actually good on 10, right? And then, yeah, this call goes badly against strong overbuild, good with good rolls, goes badly against immolation a lot of the time, and generally doesn't do well against like overbuild with King 10, but it can work for sure, especially if you're able to bait in early sends, hold them, and then increase your send. That's when it tends to go a bit better. Alright, King 10. You're thinking about this one, and this is pretty common. You're going to want to be strong on 10, or at least relatively good on 10. It's a bit whack to go King 10 if you can't actually hold 10. You also want to do good enough on 7 to keep your heals around, right? You don't want to go losing 3 or 4 heals on 7, because then you tend to be really vulnerable to like a 10 skip into 12, 13, right? Or even a potential full send 10. You generally have strong rolls, or the strong rolls that you've got, so the lanes that are actually going to hold 10, generally you're going to want them to enjoy a faster game, right? So you might have, say, an Aqua lane that's got Necro Dark Priest, right? He's a lane that's good on 10. He doesn't really like a faster game. He wants a slower game. So you're not calling King 10 for his lane. You might still call it if that's a lane on your team, but you're not calling King 10 to make his lane the carry. A lot of the time you're going to call this when your early sends are relatively weak, just because increasing the information with a 3 in particular, as we'll go into, is generally not a bad thing. If you're waiting to scout the kill speed, you're looking to see slow kill speed on your opponents, because you want them to overbuild. If you're King 10ing, right, or if you're planning to King 10, you don't want your opponents to be like 4 times, or you know, like some 7-2 freeholds and then 7-7-4, 7-7-2 freehold. That's a disaster, right? what you want is your opponents to be like really low push for a long time, so they end up lower value and they don't get the benefit of their overbuild, which would be holding your send, because they're going to push for 10 anyway. Basically because that's the meta, because if they don't, the lane will just fall off in relevance no matter what. So yeah, so good at punishing overbuild this call. Sorry about the fucking the watermark. They're not on the Imgur slide, so that'll be fine. And then yeah, you really want to deny a regen scout against the early sends. So you want to be like pretty safe 2 and 3 most of the time. It's not like disastrous if the regen gets scouted, but it generally is optimal it doesn't. It's also worth saying a lot of the time, if there are king leaks on your side, the game slows down. You have a little bit more lumber, you'll be able to push because they've sent. Your lumber goes up. They see the regen, they feel like they want to push because they've seen regen. You can then at least sometimes transition into a send as well on 4, 5, 6, 7, whenever, it doesn't matter. But that's worth thinking about as well. Alright, level 2. A lot of the time you might just be sending here if someone needs income. Like if 2, 3 lanes need like 1 gold, then if you got 4 ferbs, then it's not too bad. A lot of the time 4 ferbs on 2, you're happy enough to send it if you got 4 ferbs too, but you've only got like 1 blood orc or even 0 blood orc, send on 3 without extra time. You want your team to be decent on 3, 4, 5, because if there is time on 2, there's potential to get 4 blood orcs on 3. The current meta read is that a team that sends 2 is strong on 3, right? Which is supported by the existence of privateer. And back a couple of versions ago, it was Cannon was in that same boat. But, you still got to be considering that, right? Just because the meta read is that team that sends 2 is strong on 3, therefore don't send 3 into the team that's send on 2, right? You still have to consider it, because sometimes they will send on 3 anyway. If you're not ready to cover it, you get fully fucked, game ends, right? You've also got to be decent on 4 and 5. The current meta send is, or like the current, I guess, meta call, or the meta response to a 2 send is push and 5, right? But you gotta be confident that if your opponent send on 3, 4, 5, you don't immediately lose the game, right? Also, you can send level 2 if you're confident that you read a ship kill speed, or indeed mouth, right? Sometimes you'll see the mouth explosion or the mouth on 1. Not a lot of the time, most of the time they don't explode really, but occasionally you will with 1 mouth mixes, so it's worth having a look at that. So ship, mouth, things like that you know are weak on 2, you're kind of thinking, oh yeah, it's not too bad. Now, if your opponent's got slow kill speed, things like Sea Giant, Ig, and Clockwork, right, you're probably not loving a send on 2, just because these units, right, let's say it's a Ig with, I don't know, Young Witch Doctor for level 2, right? You send into him on 2, what's he going to do? He's going to push 2 Wisps and a Lumberjack, right? He can use all his gold from level 2 to push now. If you send into an Elite Archer and Aqua, like yes, the time increases, but they only get 1 more Wisp, so it's not the end of the world. So I would say if you're sending into generally slow kill speed on 2, it will be relatively common that your opponents are just very happy and think, hey, thank you for the free push, I appreciate it. At the moment in the meta, it's a bit of a weak send. Alrighty, another one we can call. And this one, the reason we're calling it after the start of level 1 is because the kill speed is very important here, alright? So Clog, your roles need to enjoy a slow game, right? You need to be able to push for level 5, especially for level 5, and enough before level 5 to actually get the king upgraded. Ideally you want their roles to not enjoy a slow game, right? Or at least their kill speed suggesting that they won't enjoy it. If their kill speed is fast, so suggesting units like Night Saber, Elite Archer, Aqua, these types of units, right? If you're leaking 60 to king on 5, they're going to think, whoa, 7-4 on 5 ain't bad, is it? Right? But, you know, if they're fucking some overbuildy Hydra that's 2-0 for 5, and you leak 70 to king on level 5, he's thinking, fuck, I'm stuck 4-1 forever. That's awkward. So yeah, you wanna expect to have a significant push advantage on level 5 if you're thinking about a clog. So it's worth noting with clog that it'll allow, or a properly executed clog, it'll allow like crap rolls to have just a decent game with acceptable value income, and then play off their 50 or even 100 rerolls in the mid game, while still maintaining relevant value. So, you know, if you've got someone trying to like Mudman YOLO, and you call King 10, you're gonna kill him, and that's fine. Like most of the time, that's fine if your other rolls are good. But if you've got 3 people playing Mudman YOLO, and you call King 10, you're gonna kill all 3 of them, and then that becomes a lot less fine. It's also worth noting that like a mini clog, king leaking maybe 20 units, it tends to maintain a more standard game while keeping your lanes relatively high in value, but it also just punishes overbuild. It increases the lumber in the game, but doesn't change like the value income drastically. It's also worth noting that covering 10 is important in a clog, because the matter with clog is that the clogging team will do a lot of king and then do a send on 7. The team that got clogged will do a lot of king and probably send a little bit less on 7, maybe firm it, and then both teams tend to send full on 10. So this is what you'll generally see, so it's worth noting you'll need someone to cover 10, because otherwise you can really be looking at like 35-40 king leaks on 10 if you haven't got anyone trying to hold. Level 3. Ideally you'd like 3 or 4 Blood Orcs, but for a scout you can normally get it with 2. It's generally the safest send in this matter. So lanes that are going to push will push after 3 anyway, but a lot of the time they're 2-0, 3-0 for level 3. So it's pretty rare that you feed like 1 carry lane. You know, if your opponents are, say, I don't know, Archer, 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 Sea Giant, right? If you send level 3, even if the Sea Giant goes mid, each of the archers probably don't leak much. Sea Giant gets maybe like a couple of sends in mid, not the end of the world, right? If you decide to send on level 4 and this dude's like overbuilt as hell, I don't know, saw the send coming or something, doesn't matter. It's Hydra on 4, let's say, why not? Then if you feed a Hydra lane 40-50 creeps, then like, ooh, that's a problem, right? So you generally won't be hard feeding like 1 carry lane on level 3, and the YOLOs that are able to clear generally don't get extra benefit from the quote unquote like free push, because they just push anyway. Anyway, so this would be the most consistent send at the moment to increase your information in the game without changing the game state heavily or like limiting your options, because you can still go into a King 10 from 3, makes a 5 send is still possible, especially if there's leaks on 4, if the level 3 is relatively slow. Right? You can still send 7, you can choose to overbuild, choose to push, you've still got all your options open. And yeah, the last point, it's difficult to resend 5 if no leak on 4. So if your lane's like a slow game and you're thinking about like maybe level 5 would be a nice resend, definitely consider having some of your YOLO lanes risking level 4, like no tier 1 with Archer, 350 or 370 Aqua, 450 turret, like these sorts of things. Alright, level 4. Generally you're hoping for a little bit more of a slower game, right? So you're not thinking about a King 10 or a Regen 7 game. But generally this will be when you're thinking that you don't want to send into their kill speed on 2 for whatever reason. There are lots of reasons. Maybe you scouted exactly clockwork, right? And you know it's clock. You're thinking, shit, I don't want to send into clock on 2. But we don't really get Blood Orcs on 3. Clock's pretty bad on 4. Maybe 4's okay, right? Hopefully you can see some AoE on the kill speed. So Mouth is bad on 4. Lod is often bad on 4, since the meta is to go second Lod for 5. just in general, lot isn't all that great versus send on 4. And yeah, these AoE units just tend to struggle versus Blood Orc, which it's worth noting Blood Orc is the meta send at the moment on 4. It is definitely a bit of a risky straight send, so you won't see straight 4 too often without like extra information. So extra information would be like, or specific information maybe is a better phrasing for it. So I know that if I know that the enemy team has exactly Elite Archer and Glock and one single target leak and one AoE leak, maybe level 4 looks quite good, right? So it's worth saying that level 4 itself isn't a particularly strong level, like level 7 for example, right? That's a relatively strong level. Level 4, relatively weak level. So Ascend on 4, it tends to fail, or it can often fail versus like non-specific overbuild. And all I mean by non-specific overbuild is someone's like, okay, well I'm going to stay 3-0 until the enemy team sends, and just build whatever value each level. That will generally be able to eat a level 4 send almost no matter what it is, right? Because level 4 is not a particularly strong level. Generally, it doesn't require like a direct countering or direct building against. Which is another reason why the straight send on 4 isn't that great. Anyway, into level 5. In the current overbuilding meta, straight 5 with no information or no specific information generally tends not to work, okay? It's worth saying it is good versus Flameboy, but there are just a lot of things that do well. But there are some things that do badly, so it can work, but it's a bit of a coin flip if you haven't got any extra information. It's worth saying it's specifically good versus a few strong meta units, including Privateer, Flamebeard, and Zombie. Similarly to level 4, like this, one Blood Orc in each lane tends to not be enough to break like the passive overbuild. So by passive overbuild, it's different to like the non-committal overbuild on 4. Passive overbuild is just things you see like Aqua's going 600, 3 Elite Archers, 6 or 7 turrets, like these sorts of things, right? It's like, oh yeah, I'll build +1 of like whatever AoE unit I'm building, and if they send 5, then I'll clear a lot more on my lane. This sort of like passive overbuild, one Blood Orc in each lane, is generally not going to be enough to actually like punish that properly, right? But if you're getting if your send looks more like Blood Orc Verb on each lane, that tends to get really scary and requires like not only heavier overbuild, but tends to actually require like pretty good units on 5. So yeah, if you expect a clog, you can definitely think about sending on 5. It tends to take an extra heal. It sometimes forces attack, forces your opponent to show the spell, just gives you more money, more time, more information, so it's always good. Well, it's not always good, but it's regularly good. So I was saying, if they decide not to clog and you misread that, it can be quite punishing, but these are the risks we take. Yeah, ideally you get these unexpected 5 sends where people aren't directly building verse 5, because then it can be problematic. Tends to be a good send if you're getting 3 or 4 ferbs on level 2, because that gives you the information that the other team had however many 1-0s. Let's say they sent 4 ferbs. So no 1-0 starts on the enemy team means there's not going to be a Hydra on 5. There's not going to be 2 Lods on 5. There's not going to be 2 eggs on 5. A lot of things like this. There won't be a dragon aspect, even though it's not that insane on 5. Things like that. So you can use your information to deduce at least some units that are good on 5 they may not have. Moving on. Level 6 tends to be good versus 4 fast lanes or 3 fast lanes and Ig Clockwork or Ship that you're pretty confident it's the kill speed. So if you scout that from level 1, straight 6 can work. Right? There was happening a few patches ago. Haven't seen straight 6 for a long time actually, but I still think it's quite valid. So we're saying that Blood Orc is a bad send on level 6 because it tends to just get stuck since the rocks are actually quite big. Yeah, so it's just worth putting that in as a little teaching point because I've seen that a few times. So we're saying it's the strongest send level versus a lot of the common AoE units in terms of breaking them and in terms of they have the hardest time overbuilding for it. So something like Night Saber, Elite Archer, anything trying to like overbuild a bit, it's not going to go well for them on 6. That being said, the time can still benefit them, so make of that what you will, but they generally won't be able to successfully overbuild without specific adds. So saying that level 6 is not that strong against like the quote-unquote basic overbuild lanes, so that's just things like Blaster, Hydra, these sorts of units. If they're actually like fairly overbuilt in the realm of like 850 to 1000 value, can generally do quite well. It's good, can definitely be a good send into a scouted or just assumed PD, Hades or Fire Overlord on 7, because all these lanes will be saving somewhere between 140 and 180 gold, right? So if they're saving that much gold, then you can definitely be thinking like, well, maybe they only have 750 value and some of it's in a weak unit. So we're saying that your opponents will rarely skip 7 after you send 6. The exception tends to be fucking Thornmail, but you've got to be at least aware that there's a good chance a send 7 is coming, where it may have been a full skip before. So you just have to have some level of awareness of that. You don't need to drop everything in panic, but it's, maybe you don't always full resend 7. Right, moving on, level 7. It's the strongest creep level out of the first 9, for sure, it's not even close. So we're saying you can tech your sends against your opponent's units and or their spell, right? So by strongest creep level, it just means in general it's the easiest level to break units, right? Like, yeah, some units are specifically good on 7, etc, etc, but if you just think in terms of like the value to hold to send ratio, level 7 is best for the sending team and worst for the holding team, just as a general rule of thumb, since the level itself is actually quite scary. So you can tech your sends against your opponent's units and spell. This includes like Blood Orc if you're seeing things like Hades, Ig, Night Saber overbuild, or Butcher. You can send Wyverns if you expect immolation, or just generally, Wyverns are good against a lot of King Legs. Otherwise, you can never go wrong with Verbs, Hermits, and Commanders. You're probably thinking that a send where you can break without like badly losing a trade, you're probably thinking that's okay, right? Because for the send to be worthwhile, you obviously need to break your opponents, right? It's kind of pointless if they leak like 5 units to King and fucking Fire Overlord eats it all, right? That's maybe not so good. So it's worth saying that you may not hard lose a trade in that situation because your Fire Overlord may also eat everything, but that doesn't make your send worth it a lot of the time, right? So you want to be able to actually break your opponents at least acceptably, and you want to not just lose all your fucking heals in return, right? Most of the time. So they're saying that sometimes you won't have enough information to be able to accurately assess this, but hopefully you do, or hopefully you can just make the correct assumptions with whatever information you do have. So we're saying immolation doesn't mean you have to send 7. Like if your opponents are just going to hold it, it's not so good. You see it a few times in Lil that a King 10 team gets immolation, then gets baited into sending 7, and they can end up losing the game off that if the other team is able to effectively hold their 7 send. It just reduces their send on 10 and they tend to lose 1 to 2 heals because of it. It's also worth noting that if you can't, or if you're not confident in playing a standard like 10-15 sort of game, you can send aggressively at the cost of your heals in order to trade for your opponent's heals on 7s. on 7, and then you can think about an early kill send, 10, 12, 13 being the ones that spring to mind. So that can be correct. Level 8, definitely you need information to send here, right? If your opponent's like 0 creeps to no send on level 7 and you haven't scouted them, you're not sending on 8, right? You're just not. So you definitely need some level of information. If you're able to break overbuilt lanes on level 8, you'll generally get a lot of value. So there are some units that are overbuilt for 7 that are really fucking bad on 8. Bear, Overlord, Harlot spring to mind, right? You can be seeing like 70 to 80, 80 to 90% bounties on these units while still having 15 creeps leaked. That's a lot of money. So level 8 tends to give a lot of time. The reason for this is because the creeps don't do very much damage. So the king with 20 regen can tank like, I don't know exactly how many, but a lot of acolytes. So the king leaks on level 8 tend to be resolved more slowly than a lot of other levels. So you got to consider like, is this amount or is this potential amount of time actually beneficial for you? Sometimes it's yes, sometimes it's no. So you just need to think about that. You got to consider how good you are on 10, 12, and 13 as well when you're sending on 8. And if you're bad on one of these levels, it doesn't mean you can't send 8. It just means you got to have some level of contingency, right? Because, if you send 8, your opponents are probably thinking like, okay, they want the time. They're probably pretty okay on 10 if they're sending on 8. Maybe we skip for 12, right? Maybe they have information that says that's good. Maybe they don't. Like other information. You just have to assess that on any given game state. So we're saying that 10 holders that don't get like heavily punished by your level 8 send, a lot of the time they'll push +1, right? So if I'm 7-3 with Hades and I leak, I don't know, 5 creeps to an 8 send, I'm going to push 7-4. So you can, consider that. Once again, if there's a lot of time, maybe a big resend turn can break lanes that would have been difficult to break otherwise because they also pushed. What that says down the bottom is this send doesn't punish most YOLOs in games where the YOLO lanes would try to carry, right? So all that means is that in a game where the Aqua lane is trying to carry, so in a game state where the Aqua lane is trying to carry and is the carry, the Aqua probably doesn't get punished by level 8 send very hard. In a game where the Aqua lane is the Lumber lane, yeah, sure, you break the Aqua lane, but he doesn't care, right? So a lot of these, a lot of like the good tier YOLOs, or at least YOLOs, like acceptable tier YOLOs with good rolls, if it's the game state for them to actually be a carry lane, so a slower game, a lot of the time they won't really mind these 8 sends too much. So that's worth thinking about as well. Right, level 9, 1v1, 2v2, the send is pretty good. 3v3, 4v4 tends to be crap. It's only really viable to punish like specifically weak level 9 lanes, so like Aqua, Night Saber, LOD. So you generally tend to need like specific information, otherwise just whatever that's building for 10 can hold it, and it's pretty embarrassing. Tends to be weak versus the king. Well, it is weak versus the king because only not many creeps can attack it at once, which is why it gives a lot of time, because people don't need to use like spells aggressively or up the king aggressively versus level 9 king legs. Once again, with this significant time, you need to be okay on 10, 12 or 13, or you just invite in sort of like a loss. So we're saying that if you're strong on 10 and you're expecting your opponents to send 12, sometimes like a small aura send on 9, like if your opponent's going like all in 12, like to the point where they're already king leaking on 9 to no send with just one holder, right? So we're saying that maybe auras on 9 can actually, if they don't have immolation, because then it clears the creeps out pretty quick, auras on 9 can actually increase the time enough to make your 10 send bigger. This can very occasionally be relevant if you're looking for a kill on 10 or a full break on 10 into a resend kill on 12. That's the only time where I think 9 is actually like a relevant call that can change a game state. Most of the time it's just not even thought about for good reason. Right, level 10. This is the most important level since it basically controls what happens in the mid-games as pertaining to which lanes are strong, which lanes are not, and then what the send level is a lot of the time. So if you're sending on 10, what you want is to break the opponent's holders, or at least deny their mid feed, right? Ideally you can force your opponents to upgrade the king and take their heals. It's also worth noting that sending on 10 will increase the overall value in the game, right? For your team, absolutely, but also it will increase the overall value for your opponents, right? It might share the value around more equally than a skip would, but the overall value will go up. So you just need to consider that. And this can be good for sure. If you're thinking that like, oh shit, they're really good 15, we're already thinking about a skip. How do we skip? We need to increase the amount of value that's in the game. Anyway, if you can't realistically accomplish, I would say you need to be thinking about accomplishing 2 of the above. A lot of the time skip will be preferred. The exception would be increasing value because that's a little bit different from the others. So if you can't break holders or force king ups, sending on 10 feels pretty bad, right? If you can't take heals or deny mid feed, then it's maybe not so great. You know, sometimes it's correct still, of course. It's just something to consider. So we're saying that a skip will feel a lot better if the opponents share feed on 3 or 4 of the lanes rather than like 2 lanes getting fat as fuck and eating like 6 bosses each. That tends to be a problem. But if they're all getting like equal amounts of bosses, 3 each, then none of them are gonna like be just massive unbreakable lanes unless they already were in a very, very strong spot. It's also worth saying that Pudge is a good send to just break on 10. The lifesteal does a lot, and just sending dinos are better versus lanes that aren't going to be very good or really trying to hold 10 and will make you fatter overall. Moving on. Level 11, once again, it's better in 1v1 and 2v2, and this is just because that a lot of units are relatively weak on level 11, but in 4v4 it's too weak versus the king because there are 4 people to upgrade it. If there are only 2 people to upgrade the king, those upgrades are a lot more punishing because they're a bigger percent of the total number of the team each upgrade. Same as auras on 9, auras on 11 can give you a bigger send on 12 and 13, but 11 just fucking sucks versus the king. So we're saying it might occasionally be a better option than 12 king 17 or 12 17, because the point of 12 17 is generally to get king leaks and force king ups. Very occasionally level 11 might do that better if the other team is like 4 elite archers, maybe. But even then, a lot of the time you're probably looking at a 15 game. I don't know, it's very rarely a viable option. It's a level that kind of happens. I don't know. Yeah, you can't really send on 11 most games. Okay, level 12. It is very, very dependent on the opponent's units and spells, because some units, like Elite Archer, will hold this with comparatively low value, and some spells, Shockwave and Thornmail, are very, very good, whereas some spells, like Stomp and Immolation, are literally useless. So yeah, it's very, very information dependent. Luckily it's after level 10, so you'll have the information of what all your opponents have on each of their lanes. So we're saying that a lot of setups that take feed on level 10 are relatively weak on 12. These include things like Hades, Necromancers, maybe things with Fire Overlords and Pure Darknesses, these sorts of units. A lot of the time they're weak on 12. But of course some others are strong on 12, including Butcher, maybe Night Saber, things like this. It is a very weak send into 0 value because the actual level 12 creeps don't do that much damage, it's the ballistas doing all the damage. So if they go to the king early and get killed quickly without letting a big stack of ballistas build up, that's a big problem. Level 12 generally requires setup pre-10, so you need to be considering 12 as an option before level 10 a lot of the time. So even though I've said it's after level 10, so you have that information of your opponent's lanes, you need to have at least set it up somewhat before level 10 in the vast majority of games. And if it's a game where you didn't need to set it up pre-level 10 at all, chances are you're just stupidly far ahead. So we're saying that the team that's sending on 12 is generally like somewhat vulnerable if it fails, because they haven't had the income from level 10. They're like a couple of levels behind on income. If they, if the enemy king was already full or something like that, right? And you don't kill them, then you're going to be feeling weak on the value side, and you've just given them extra time. So can be risky in that sense, but it's a very good send, a very relevant send as well. Level 13, the not a meme send anymore. Once again, very unit dependent. Elite archers, flamebeards, TS, Malf, Nightsaber, all of these units are insane on 13. Some units are just absolute crap on 13 as well. So we're saying it can be a resend after level 10, a lot more than level 12, just because of that extra level of lumber makes a big difference. And because the level 13 creeps are a lot more dangerous on the king than the level 12 creeps. The surprise can definitely be a strong factor. So a lot of people still have in their heads that like, oh yeah, it's level 13, it's a fucking easy to hold meme level. It's kind of not the case anymore. It is also very good versus immolation. Obviously, immolation not affecting the creeps at all. But yeah, it still is a somewhat weak level against just like units that are all around good. So high value lanes like the 2800 to 3k that got fed potentially off a 10 skip is going to be difficult to break those on 13 most of the time. It's also worth saying that a lot of the time it has to be a kill send, otherwise you tend to struggle. Like if your opponent has no king, somehow has no king and is weak on 13, then honestly that's probably their fault for playing badly rather than a common sort of game state. But yeah, relevant send for sure. Can be a good kill. If you take 2 heals from someone with immolation, or if you have immolation and lose 2 heals on 7, I already start thinking about how they're looking or how we're looking on 13. Playing versus Romy a couple of times, had nightmares about fucking dying on 13 like 2 games in a row. Miserable bastard he is. Alright, moving on. Level 14. So a lot of the units that are strong on level 15 are relatively weak on 14, obviously because units that are good on 15 for the most part have magic damage. And magic damage is pretty bad against medium armor. I know, it's shocking, isn't it? But it is worth saying that it's quite value dependent, right? Because at the end of the day, gargoyles are like only so strong, right? Not quite no matter how many you send, but realistically you're only getting 5 gargoyles each lane in 99% of cases. Like 5 gargoyles on each lane is a good 14 send. But 3.2k of like decent units will generally be able to hold, and sometimes you see like 3.6k lanes on 14 if the game's a bit fatter. So value needs to be a consideration. You can definitely use it to undercut 15 and try and kill your opponent or at least force them to king. It's also worth saying that it can be used as an income send as an undercut, right? If you can survive 15 due to the extra income you've got on 14, and then you're building for 16/17 and you're confident you can live both, and then turn the game into like where you can resend 20, then yeah, it can be a pretty fucking good undercut as an income send for sure. So if you send 14 and then have too much value to die 15, and build for 17 so that you can hold their send. Presumably you can hold 18 most of the time then as well. Their option becomes like 20 or 21, and if there are leaks, a lot of the time you can look to resend, and that can sometimes be a very nice call for you, right? Where you just get too fat to die on 15, 16, 17, 18, and can win a race on 20, 21. So, you know, as I was saying, that can be definitely a good call. But the fatter the game is, the worse this send is, because 14 just fares badly against big value lanes overall. Last thing I'll add is that you need to be aware of units that can snipe the gargoyles. These include low value tox. High value tox will just mid, but low value tox will damage gargoyles. Disciples can snipe gargs, and turrets, particularly upgraded turrets, like to snipe gargoyles as well. The gargoyles are basically all the damage from this, right? The Tuskers are relevant on the king as well, but you need the gargs to the king. So if you're sending into one lane that can mid and 3 lanes that can damage gargoyles, it tends to not go particularly well. Moving on, the one, the only level 15. It is the strongest send in the meta, because it's difficult to skip due to fucking RNG. That is RNG of Mr. Infernal, which lane he decides to spawn on. Spoiler alert, it is always the worst one. And it's also just the RNG of like where the demon is. If the demon decides to walk forwards quickly and start attacking early, that's a problem. If the demon considers level 15 as like the equivalent of a fucking holiday resort on Bali where he can lay on the beach and definitely not smoke any weed, then that tends to make it a lot easier to hold. So it's RNG a lot of the time, and it just be like that. So in terms of sense, 3100, it can break strong lanes for sure, but it can also give freeholds, and because sometimes lanes will just get no behemoth and then like 2400 send sort of thing, and it's just not that scary. So consider when the 3100 is good. I would say generally it's good if you want to break strong lanes, but if you think that your opponents are dying to or are leaking to 2600 sends, then I would put the warlocks in there. So unless you feel that you're favoured in a level 15 race, or that you're just trying to find Jesus, so you definitely want to consider like avoiding a 15 game, and there are a lot of ways to do that, right? So a couple of ways you can do. You can avoid 15 is kinging. You can send 12, 13, 14. You can also have your strong lanes income sending and your weak lanes saving. So watch the next video that's coming out with this one, and you'll see an example of that where it almost worked and it was the correct call for them. So all your early calls, right? Level 1, from level 1, in terms of like what you're calling, which lanes you're calling like for, in the sense that it's like when you're calling, you're generally not benefiting every single one of your lanes. In a lot of game states, a lot of the time you're benefiting like, you want to benefit the lanes that you consider strongest, right? You want to make your strong lanes shine. So your lanes with good units shine. But generally your early calls before the game's sort of shaped out into a more defined game state, you should assume it's a 15 game. And the reason you should assume it's a 15 game is because 95% of the time it is. It's either a 15 game or someone trying to dodge 15. Because it's just that important of a level. So yeah, most of the time it's good. So if you feel you're favoured, it's a good send. It's difficult to skip, but sometimes it can be, and sometimes you just need to have a little bit of faith. Right, moving on. 16. Once again, unit dependent, pretty much because the lead arch is a thing, tends to do quite well here. It's also worth saying 16 is quite high RNG for a lot of units, because if that demon spawns in front and gets sniped quickly, the level is quite easy to hold. If the demon does not get sniped quickly, or if even worse, it tanks like 1500 damage and then regens thanks to the Kraken, it can be a little bit bullshit. So it's worth saying it's rarely a surprise. Most of the time, when there's a 16 send, your opponents are going to be like at least somewhat expecting it. But it does tend to require some level of commitment to actually cover it, right? Because the units that are strong 16 and 17 are basically completely different with the exception of TOC. And there's not that many overlaps of units that are good 15 and 16 as well. The ones that spring to mind would be Hydra and Griffin. So we're saying that if you send 10 and don't end up with big bank out of it, a no-leak 16 is generally going to be too small of a send to break your opponents. It can still do the job, but in general, if it's like a sort of average value game, that no-leak send, the 21, 2300 sends, they tend to not quite get the job done. So if you're in a desperate situation and you're sending versus things like elite archers, turrets, these like squishy massed pierce units, Infernal can be a good tech to break those lanes, but it's pretty bad versus just the majority of units. So it's worth saying if you've correctly managed to or if you've managed to skip 15 and survive Ascent, so like firstly good job, and then you generally don't want to just turn around and send 16, because not only is it unit dependent, but it's also a little bit like 14 in the sense that just like big values of okay units will just do fine on 16, right? So, but if there are units such as Ship and PD, probably the big two that spring to mind, that are just really good on 17 and on 20, 16 can be a good send, because those two units are fucking awful 16. There are more units like that, but those are probably the big two that spring to mind that are strong on 17 and 20. Moving on. Level 17. Pretty rare send in the meta, to be honest. You don't see 17 very often. So it's generally only seen like after a skip 15. It's very rare that both teams go no league 17 because of the next 2 points, right? And that's firstly that if it's a no league 17 game, so a 10-17 game, you also need to be able to cover 16, because your opponent can decide that they want to leak on 14-15 and then send 16 and like, oh fuck, we haven't leaked, we can't send 15, they're good on 16, and you lose the game, right? That can happen sometimes, so that's part of the reason why it's rare. You need to be good enough on 16 and 17, or at least good enough on 17 to be able to win the race, if it is indeed a race. Also, there's a lot of time to reroll after level 10. Obviously you've got 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and 16 worth of gold. If you reroll like after arena and you get mutant, that's a lot of levels of building mutant, right? If it's a 15 game, there's 2 less levels to build those hydras you just rerolled into, right? So it's basically, if you're just starting to build anti-17 from after arena, you're going to have more value of actively anti-17 by the time 17 rolls around, compared to if you started building anti-15 for 15 at the same point. You'll have less value of anti-15, right? And this is especially if you're not getting scouts, because if you are getting scouts, that means there's leaks, and if there are leaks, a lot of the time it just is a 15 send. Not always, but a lot of the time. It's also worth saying that like 2600 sends on 17 tend not to be enough to break lanes that have around 5k value of acceptable units, or 46 to 5k of good units. Any more than that, it's actually quite hard to break. Right, level 18. Pretty weak level. It's really fucking bad versus slow aura, I've noticed. I don't know why. Just hate slow aura. You'll only really see it after a team successfully like survives an early ascend, and then it's kind of just used to counter mutant. Is the only real one that's like actively bad on 18. Kind of Hydra if they've got a siege backline as well, but pretty rare send. I haven't seen an 18 send in a long time. Moving on. Level 19. 2 reasons you send on 9. Number 1, you can't win that 20 race. You're dead on 20. You just send and pray that too many of them tried to split. Number 2, if you do win on 19, oh, you better be talking some shit afterwards because you fucking killed someone on 19, and that is just embarrassing. Alright, to finish off, 20 and 21. Depends on your opponent's units as well as your units, because it's very rare that 21 isn't somewhat of a race. So you got to consider that which level is your opponent better. You've also got to consider which level are we better, or which level are we okay on, right? So we're saying as well, if you decide to not skip 20 because of the arena 2, your opponents will get like maybe 1k, maybe even more lumber each on their lanes, right? So if you're estimating that they can't send 20 because they don't have enough lumber, well, by the time 21 rolls around, that may be a different story. It needs to be thought about. So for 20, unless you've got like big fucking wood, like 5k-ish each, I would just almost always go for mass. I don't exactly know the the maths or the exact reasoning behind it, but I was high on shamans for a while, started trying mass more and more recently, had a few 20 games, and like mass feels really good on 20. Like mass is hard to hold on 20. So yeah, there you go. I would recommend it most of the time. But obviously you can look at your opponent's units, determine what's good versus mass and what's bad versus mass. In fairness, the things that are good versus mass tend to be the AoE units, which tend to be bad on 20 anyway. So anyway, yeah, core depends which level you feel better on and which they look worse on. It's also worth saying that if you do skip 20, there's potential for your opponent to send on Arena 2, which will be like 300, 350 value each maybe, considering that the income plus the presumed Arena win. So we're saying that if you send on Arena 2, don't fucking send dinos, send the big units. The reason you don't want to send those dinos, because they'll actually clog your units up in the arena and make it harder for you to win. So I've seen people throw Arena 2 because they think, oh, we'll just income send full dinos here. You know, she's gold. And they get, I don't know, maybe, say 100 gold each from the dinos, and then they lose 200 gold each because they didn't win the arena because their units couldn't fucking move. So, you know, that's what I'm thinking about. Anyway, like, subscribe, all of that. Make sure you watch that next video. And yeah, I'll catch you in the next one.